Japan is often considered a Western nation, even though it is basically as far away from Western Europe as it's possible to get. And as proof of this, nothing says Western country like celebrating Christmas, and nothing says Christmas like apparently hunkering down with your favorite box of Colonel's original recipe and extra crispy. That story begins here. I mean, the story of Japan, not Colonel Sanders. So previously on AP World History, we had the Japanese Warring States period where Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu comes out ahead without losing his head, and he manages to consolidate all political power in Japan under the Bakufu tent government. To maintain power, Tokugawa basically creates a surveillance state in which daimyo are forced to spend every other year chilling out with Tokugawa in Edo Castle. And you also have the fact that Christianity and most trade are officially banned in Japan. We are now going to pick up where the story left off. And for the most part, not much has really changed in Japan, not dramatically. And remember, that's by choice. Both culturally, socially, technologically, Japan has kind of chosen to remain frozen in time. I'm not going to tell you that Japan is exactly like Amish country, but, I could sort of see some superficial resemblances. Amish samurai. That needs to be like the protagonist of the Assassin's Creed game, I think. The one that's set in Japan. They need to add a third protagonist. Anyway, during the first half of the 19th century, the shogunate continued to combine a centralized bureaucracy under the Bakufu government with feudal alliances with the local daimyo. The shogunate is running into many financial problems, however. So taxes are almost exclusively based on agriculture and land. It's basically an old-style system of taxation. And this is despite the growing power of commerce and trade in Japan. And yes, there is at least internal commerce and trade. Japan is also becoming much more secular. Schools and academies have expanded during this time period where, among other things, Dutch studies, or rangaku, are taught. Confucianism is still taught. So going back for just a second, one of the reasons that the Dutch successfully maintained some presence in Japan, or at least some influence in Japan, is it was seen that the Dutch are less pushy. However, you could see sort of examples of, Dutch influence. This is a Japanese drawing of a Dutch hot air balloon. But still, for the most part, even though commerce and manufacturing has increased during this era, the shogunate was technologically behind the West, and Japan still doesn't have any real industry. All this changed because America. So in 1853 to 1854, you have the Perry expedition sent to Japan. This is named for the commanding officer, American Commodore Matthew Perry, where he basically cozies right up to Edo Bay, which is right off, modern-day Tokyo, and basically threatens Japanese bombardment if Americans are not allowed to trade there. So this is the equivalent of the United States pointing a gun at Japan's head and basically saying, be my friend or else. Now, Japan would like to choose else, but the problem for the Bakufu is that Commodore Perry's black ships, as they were called, are equipped with the latest in naval technology, especially cannon technology. Perry's ships could fire from miles inland. Japan's cannons and muskets were incredibly primitive compared to the firepower at the disposal of the Americans. So basically, if Japan refused, Edo would be destroyed or pulverized. So the Japanese felt as if they had to comply, which, by the way, is not humiliating whatsoever. Later on, Perry returns with an even larger fleet of 7 ships to receive the shogun's answer. And the shogun answered that basically the United States could get at least two ports, and the British, the Dutch, and the Russians could also gain ports of their own. This was formalized in the signing of the Treaty of Kanagawa, which is kind of thought of as being a model of one of the unequal treaties, as it was called. Basically, a treaty that is forced upon Japan by American gunboat diplomacy. The fact that the shogun was forced to sign this humiliating treaty undermined his authority, which is one of the reasons why in 1868 to 1869 you have a civil war in Japan called the Boshin War. This begins with a rebellion in basically the island of Kyushu, which is the southernmost island in Japan, basically right around here. So this rebellion was at first localized, but the Emperor Kome, had become increasingly outspoken in his distaste for the unequal treaties signed by the shogunate. And so a lot of these samurai rally around the emperor as a figurehead. So now we have basically a war between southern Japan and northern Japan. Southern being, the pro-imperial force, North being the pro-shogunate force. But now we also have a war between the emperor and the shogun. Both sides try to modernize. Both sides use modern military tactics and equipment. So the samurai in general are interested in westernization, especially with military technology and military tactics. It does say the shogunate wants to cling to tradition. That is true, but a lot of this is because the shogunate just appears to be weak. As it turns out, the imperial forces were more modern and slightly better led and equipped, and this leads to basically a defeat of the Tokugawa forces. The Tokugawa, I think Tokugawa Yoshinobu. Let me check my notes here. Go with your first instinct. It was Tokugawa Yoshinobu. He is basically forced to sign a document that renounces his claim to the office of shogun, and he goes into sort of private exile. This leads to an event that you should star, underline, highlight, whatever you have to do, because it's only one of the most important events in Japanese history, and that is the Meiji Restoration. This is where basically Japanese power consolidates around the emperor. The emperor isn't making a lot of day-to-day decisions. Meiji's not that kind of emperor, but the government is basically run in his name. Even though the imperial faction was rebelling against Western influences, they ironically ended up adopting a lot of them. In fact, Meiji is remembered for his 4 modernizations. So one is, of course, military organization. So Japan adopts a modern national army. Samurai, and just to be honest, really the best and brightest of Japanese society around this time period are sent to Western Europe and the United States, where they're basically just studying what works, what makes a modern state a modern state. And so at first, they more or less copy-paste the French army and try to create a Japanese army along French lines. Then remember in 1870 to 71, the whole Franco-Prussian War thing happens. Germany defeats France, and so from that point on, Japan bases its army on Germany. So the conscription law in 1873 creates a modern army, and it effectively abolishes the samurai as a class. I say that with more than a little bit of nuance, because it doesn't mean that the samurai ethos, the ideology, dies. Remember that the samurai ethos is contained in the Bushido Code. So what kind of happens eventually is that many of the Army and Navy officers in this new modernized military sort of see themselves as the descendants of the samurai. And in fact, when we get to the Russo-Japanese War, we see that, I would argue, the Japanese regular army fight more like the samurai of Bushido than the actual samurai do during the Warring States period. Japanese forces regularly had to charge through barbed wire, trenches, gunfire, machine gun fire, artillery, problems that the samurai of the 15 and 1600s never would never have to sort of cope with. Also, one of the generals who was tasked with besieging Port Arthur during the Russo-Japanese War lost all of his children during the storming operation. And he's actually prepared to commit ritualistic suicide like a samurai until he is personally dissuaded from doing so by the emperor. This does prove to be unpopular in some quarters, and so in 1877, there's the Satsuma Rebellion, which is a samurai uprising led by a general by the name of Saigo Takamori. I want you to imagine a world where George Washington, after the American Revolution, decided that the British were right all along and launched a rebellion in Virginia. That's basically what the Satsuma Rebellion is. Saigo Takamori was one of the most influential and successful of the military commanders in the Boshin War who fought for the emperor. Now he's basically rising up on behalf of the samurai class. However, his rebellion is crushed with the more modern troops of the Meiji government. In terms of political changes, the political changes were radical. So I want you to kind of think back to the end of feudalism in Western Europe. We talked about the decline of feudalism in France in the 14 and 1500s, and yet it is still declining even during the reign of Louis XIV. So it takes hundreds of years for feudalism to decline in France. In Japan, it takes maybe a couple dozen. The daimyo are basically replaced with prefects, and the government becomes centralized. Like there's a dramatic shift from regional power to centralized power. And that all takes place within just a few years. You have the creation of a parliament along German lines. It's called the Diet, which is not that kind of diet. It basically just means an assembly. And one thing to kind of remember is that Parliament advises the government but does not control it. It also doesn't have political parties the way modern parliaments do. So you don't have like Democrats and Republicans. What's more the case is that most of the major factions in Japanese society are represented in parliament. So like the industrialists or the military, the army, the navy, the bureaucracy, they're represented in the Diet. But it's not as if the Diet really functionally represents people across society. The Diet basically gives legitimacy to tax increases, and there were a lot of tax increases during the Meiji period. Finally, you see the reorganization of the bureaucracy, which was never particularly strong in Japan compared to, say, China. Well, now it becomes particularly strong. And we have a civil service exam to sort of support it. So with a Japanese society that is reorganizing itself from top to bottom, you need an educational system to support it. So perhaps in imitation of Germany's national schools, Japan creates universally mandated primary schools. And by 1868, Japan has the highest literacy rate of any country in East Asia. It's important to note that even though Japan seemed mesmerized with all things Western, that only applied to their technology and government, the things that seemed like they provided material benefit to Western countries. Confucianism and the emphasis on filial piety is still emphasized in education. Also, Christianity was largely avoided. So Japan's whole strategy during the late 19th and early 20th centuries basically revolves around the phrase, if you can't beat them, join them. So the best way to prevent yourself from being colonized by a European empire is to basically become a European empire yourself. So Meiji Japan decides to industrialize, and this results in the establishment of things like strong national banks, technological training, an army and navy that are westernized, factories, for example, ironworks, steelworks, railroads, and importantly for the Japanese Navy, steamships. So We saw state-led industrialization attempted in Russia, and Russia has many times the resources and population of Japan. So why is it that Russia doesn't industrialize that much, but Japan very much does, to the extent that by the early 20th century is the leading industrial power of East Asia? And one of the leading industrial powers on planet Earth? Well, the answer is severalfold. One, remember that Russia has the problem of dismal educational uh, achievements. The school system was just practically non-existent. Japan heavily invested in education. You also have the fact that in Russia, industrialization was kind of given a lukewarm reception, and partially that's because it threatened the power of the aristocracy, which is still in existence in Russia. In the case of Japan, the old aristocracy has basically been converted into new style bureaucrats. The old style aristocracy made their rebellion, the Satsuma Rebellion, and they lost. And so there's much more elite buy-in into industrialization than you see, for example, in Russia during that same time period. Despite all of this, the problem with Japan is that despite the fact that it is still the third largest economy on planet Earth, it is still very resource poor, especially in iron, coal, and just fossil fuels in general. And so it will remain dependent on the West for many goods, including the things that are most important for Japan's industrialization. Also, you have extremely high taxes that are levied to basically promote all of this industry. So it's one thing to be strong, but a lot of Japan's strategy revolved around deterrence, appearing to be strong so that other nations, particularly Western European nations, would basically refrain from colonizing it. So the question is, how can you show strength? Well, unfortunately, the answer that many throughout history have turned to is good old-fashioned war. And so in 1894 to 1895, there's the Sino-Japanese War. So the Sino-Japanese War is basically because of tensions between Japan and China over increasing Japanese presence in the Korean Peninsula. Remember, Korea has been a tribute state of China since practically its foundation. And so Japan and China basically are squabbling over influence. There's also the fact that Japan needs new raw materials, and it feels that, if it is a European empire, well, it needs colonies like a European empire. So in many ways, this is sort of a repeat of the Opium Wars. China is larger in terms of population and total amount of wealth. Japan, however, is more industrialized, and its military technology reflects that industrialization. And so the Japanese are basically able to very quickly defeat the Chinese, even though China is in many ways, on paper, much stronger. This leads in 1902 to Britain sort of abandoning its traditional policy of isolationism so it can ally with Japan. Finally, in 1904 to 1905, we have the Russo-Japanese War, which we've already talked about a good bit in the Russia lecture. The important thing to take home here is, on the one hand, the Japanese decisively defeat Russia at sea under Admiral Togo. Yeah, the Battle of Tsushima is considered one of the decisive naval victories of all time. On land, the picture is a lot more mixed. The Japanese won lots of the battles, but at tremendous losses. The problem with the Russians is that the Russians have very poor railway infrastructure. They can only bring so many troops into eastern Russia, basically the Manchuria area, at a time. And so Japan is basically just able to outmobilize Russia. But if the war had drug on much longer, the Japanese probably would have lost that war on land. So the Japanese, on the one hand, won a decisive victory, but on the other hand, they also cashed in their chips while they still could. Remember, this is the first time in a very long time that a non-white power has decisively defeated a white power. It's at least the first time this has really happened during the age of industrialization. So, as a reflection of this, the United States actually gives Japanese citizens the status of honorary white people in what is called the Gentleman's Agreement with the United States. So the Japanese, slowly but surely, are sort of being considered almost like Europeans by the Americans and the Europeans. Using its newfound influence, Japan annexes Korea in 1910. This creates a very troubled and very traumatic history of Japanese presence on the Korean Peninsula, because it's not as if they just incorporate Korea into the Japanese Empire. They literally try to destroy Korean culture and tell the Koreans that they're basically just Japanese people. I'll let you read the points here because most of them speak for themselves. What I want to emphasize here, though, is just the idea that one, there are still disputes between generations. The older generations generally revere the old ways, the basically the Japan that was before the Boshin War and before the Perry expedition. But what I also want to emphasize is that Japan is adopting Western institutions, it's adopting Western technology, it's a little bit more reluctant to adopt Western culture, and it's especially reluctant to adopt Western style religions. So Japan, even though outside appearances are changing, it still remains true to itself on the inside. And maybe that desire to preserve that which already exists is the secret to why Japan was able to industrialize and modernize so quickly. This is called one of the great economic and developmental miracles of the 19th and 20th centuries, a time period where there are a lot of industrial and developmental miracles. So if you look at Japan, Japan is like just an entirely different country from what it was 30 or 40 years ago. Um, but one of the things that modernity can kind of fool us with is it gives us the appearance that it can do it all. It can provide us anything that we really want. But we know that modernity and technology can't do that. And when people discover that all the modern technology in the world doesn't prevent horrible things from happening, arguably people go back to the old ways. And that is where we'll pick up next time when we get to Japan in the 1920s. Until then.